There is a certain kind of photograph from the late 1800s that has a strange power over the imagination. You have probably seen one even if you did not realize what you were looking at. A grand building with heavy stone columns and ornate windows stands proudly on a quiet street. But something is wrong. There is a detail hidden in plain sight. The entire first floor of the building is underground. People in old-fashioned clothes stroll by at the level of what should have been the second story. Doorways sit half buried beneath the pavement. Windows meant to look out onto the street now stare into darkness. Staircases descend from the sidewalk into what used to be the front entrance. The ground seems to have risen, swallowing the lower level of the structure as if the earth had silently pushed upward during the night. And the odd thing is this: it was not just one building. It was not just one town or one photograph or one isolated example that could be explained away as an architectural quirk. These images exist in cities across the world: New York, Chicago, Boston, London, Paris, St. Petersburg. Even small towns tucked into quiet corners of America and Europe show the same strange feature. Buildings that look as if they sank into the earth or as if the world rose around them. If you search through old archives, you begin to notice a pattern. The street stands too high. The foundation sits too low. The windows lie under the soil instead of above it. The mind rebels because the picture feels like a mistake, a misprint, something that should not be. You stare at it because the more you look, the more questions appear. If you feel like sharing, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. And just a gentle reminder, the images in this episode are here only to help evoke the mood of the story. The mystery itself lives beyond them. Thank you for being here and walking these strange paths with us. Why would people build a grand entrance only to bury it underground soon after? Why would architects create ornate stonework on levels no one would ever see? Why do so many cities from the same century share the same strange trait? For years, these photographs sat quietly in historical libraries and museum drawers. Archivists logged them and stored them away, without suspecting that ordinary viewers would one day look at them and think the same unsettling thought. This does not make sense. Eventually, a new generation of curious minds went searching for answers. They did not find them in textbooks or history courses. Instead, they found these images drifting through online forums and message boards where people were asking the exact same questions you might be asking right now. How can so many buildings from the 1800s look as if they were already ancient ruins beneath the modern world? Some viewers suggested construction quirks. Others blamed poor drainage or changes in city planning. But those explanations did not satisfy everyone. The photographs felt heavier than that, like fragments of a forgotten story. A story that did not appear in school lessons. Imagine standing on a quiet street beside one of these buildings. Imagine brushing your hand along the stone wall and feeling the ground level far above where the original architects intended it to be. The building seems older than the soil around it. It seems older than the city itself, as if the ground is lying, as if history shifted at some point and no one recorded the moment. These photographs are the doorway into the mud flood mystery, the spark that ignited a theory that should not exist, yet refuses to go away. Because if there are dozens of images like this, or hundreds or thousands, what does that imply? Were these structures buried slowly over time? Were they intentionally covered? Or did something else happen? Something sudden? Something no historian ever mentioned? These old images have a strange quietness to them, a stillness that hides a much louder question. If so many buildings from the 1800s appear half buried, then what else from that era might not be what it seems? As we move deeper into this investigation, keep this first mystery in mind. The photographs are real. The buildings are real. You can visit many of them today. They sit with their windows still under the soil and their entrances still below the street level. silent witnesses of a past that looks slightly wrong. The question is not whether these buildings look buried. They do. The question is why. And that question will follow us through every part of this story as we search for an answer that might be stranger than any of the theories built around it. Before the mud flood became a global fascination, it was nothing more than a strange pattern noticed by a handful of people who spent too much time looking at old photographs. It did not begin in universities or museums. There were no academic papers, no documentaries, no conferences. The theory did not rise from historians who studied the 19th century. It rose from ordinary people who saw something strange and asked a question that no one else seemed to be asking. In the early years of the internet, when forums were still quiet and social media had not yet swallowed the world, a few users began posting images of buildings that looked partly submerged by the earth around them. The posts were simple: a photograph, a caption, a question. Why does this look buried? At first the discussion was casual. People assumed there had to be simple explanations: soil build-up, street level changes, drainage projects. But the more images people shared, the more the questions grew. The pattern was too consistent, too global, too difficult to ignore. How did so many cities end up with buildings whose first floors were now underground? And why did this keep happening in photographs from the same century? As more people joined the conversation, something interesting happened. Instead of fading, the mystery deepened. Users began comparing notes. A picture from Boston looked almost identical to one from Paris. A building in St. Petersburg shared the same half-buried design as one in San Francisco. It did not matter what continent the photograph came from. The same odd detail appeared again and again. These discussions moved across platforms like migrating birds, from forgotten message boards to larger communities, from niche websites to video platforms with millions of viewers. And as the theory spread, it began to take shape, not through experts or institutions, but through a swarm of curious minds trying to assemble a puzzle from pieces scattered across time. In a way, the internet was the perfect birthplace for such an idea. It rewards anomalies. It amplifies questions that do not have easy answers. It allows strangers from around the world to compare evidence that once sat in dusty archives and hidden collections. A photograph that once belonged to a local history museum could now be examined by thousands of people within minutes. And this is how the mud flood theory shifted from a curiosity to a cultural phenomenon. Not because someone claimed to have the truth, but because no one had a satisfying answer. The mystery was not solved. It was shared. There is a strange power in collective curiosity. When enough people ask the same question, the question itself becomes louder. For many, the mud flood offered a chance to look at history from a different angle, to challenge what they had been taught, to imagine a world where the past was not entirely as it seemed. Others approached the theory with skepticism, but found themselves unable to dismiss it. There were simply too many photographs, too many architectural oddities, too many unexplained details in cities that had grown and changed for over a century. The internet had revealed a pattern that no single historian had ever compiled, because no single historian had ever gathered evidence from so many places at once. The real turning point came when creators began making videos exploring the possibility that a major event had taken place in the 19th century and somehow left behind these buried structures. These early videos did not claim certainty. They simply asked questions. But questions are powerful fuel. Before long, the mud flood mystery became a kind of modern folklore, a digital legend born out of archived photos and unanswered curiosities. People wondered if a catastrophe had swept across continents. Others suspected that something had been erased from the historical record. Some saw patterns, others saw coincidences. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. The photographs did not look right, and that was enough. Enough to give life to a theory, enough to turn scattered observations into a story, enough to make people wonder what else might be buried beneath the ground or beneath the narrative of history itself. The internet did not create the mud flood theory out of nothing. It simply gave a voice to questions that had been hiding in plain sight for more than a century. Questions that will only become louder as we move deeper into the mystery and examine why so many people believe that an entire chapter of human history might be missing. When a theory does not begin with experts but with ordinary people, something interesting happens. Anyone can contribute. Anyone can challenge. Anyone can reshape the idea. And that freedom is exactly what allowed the mud flood mystery to evolve into one of the most debated historical questions of the digital age. But this is only the beginning. Because once the theory was born, the next step was inevitable. People began searching for evidence, and what they found would push the conversation far beyond photographs. If you want to understand why the mud flood theory refuses to disappear, you have to look at the evidence that first convinced its earliest supporters. Not theories, not speculation, physical details, architectural patterns, things that anyone can see with their own eyes. These details are scattered across thousands of photographs and hundreds of surviving buildings. And for many people, they raise questions that seem to resist simple explanations. The first and most obvious detail is the buried window. In city after city, you find rows of windows sitting below the level of the sidewalk. They are not small or decorative. They were clearly designed to be above ground with full frames and ornate stonework. Yet today they open into soil or dim basement chambers. They look out onto the earth instead of the street. When you see one or two, it feels like an oddity. When you see hundreds, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Then there are the half-buried doors. Grand entrances with steps that now descend into darkness. Doorways that once welcomed guests now require you to walk downward as if entering a cellar. Many of these entrances are framed by detailed carvings, which means their creators expected the doorway to be seen at eye level. And yet the ground now reaches the midpoint of the stonework. It creates the impression that the building has sunk, or that the world around it has risen. Another detail often cited by believers is the depth of the foundation. In many 19th century buildings, the foundation extends far deeper than seems necessary for structures of their size. Some basements show stone arches and heavy support beams that look excessively engineered compared to what would normally be required. This invites a provocative question. Were these features designed for basements, or were they originally parts of a ground floor that is now hidden? There is also the curious matter of repeated construction styles. Buildings in distant cities share uncanny similarities. Heavy stone blocks perfectly shaped, arched windows with matching proportions, facades that echo the same aesthetic even when built continents apart. Believers point to this as evidence of a lost architectural system or shared blueprint rather than unrelated local choices. They argue that the consistency suggests a global tradition rather than coincidence. Another recurring element is the buried stairway. You can find staircases that once rose proudly toward an entrance but now lead downward from the street. The top step meets the sidewalk while the bottom step sinks into the earth. This inverted architecture gives the unsettling impression that the building has been reversed by time. Supporters of the mud flood theory often focus on these patterns not because they have definitive answers, but because they see the same anomalies repeated in places with no direct connection to each other. They argue that the questions multiply too quickly for coincidence to feel satisfying. If these were isolated quirks of construction or results of urban development, then why do they appear in cities founded at different times in different climates under different governments? The theory also draws strength from the fact that these details remain visible today. You can walk down a street in Chicago or Paris or St. Petersburg and see the buried windows and half-submerged facades for yourself. They are not hidden in archives or behind museum glass. They are part of the living world. And because they are still there, It forces a simple and powerful question into the conversation. If these buildings were constructed in the late 1800s, then why do so many of them look as if they were built for a ground level that no longer exists? Skeptics offer explanations involving city planning changes or the slow accumulation of soil. And in some cases, those answers are correct. But for many believers, the explanations feel incomplete. They see too many repeated anomalies compressed within the same century. They see too many buildings altered in ways that seem counterintuitive. They see a landscape that looks edited not over centuries, but in a single era. To them, the inconsistencies form a kind of code, a repeating signal across continents, a sign that something significant might have happened in the recent past, something that left behind physical traces more convincing than any written record, something that does not fit comfortably into the timeline of the 19th century. Whether or not that interpretation is correct, the effect is undeniable. Once someone notices the buried windows and sunken doors, it becomes difficult not to see them everywhere. And once the pattern appears, it generates its own momentum. It creates a sense of possibility that something unusual might be lurking beneath the familiar surface of modern history. The evidence is not hidden, it is standing in plain sight, and for many people that alone is enough to keep the mystery alive. When people first encounter the mud flood theory, they often assume the mystery revolves only around architecture. But something else sits just beneath the surface of this story, something that makes the 19th century feel strangely fragile. A pattern of disasters. Fires that erupted in major cities across the Western world in a span so short it begins to sound impossible. Take Chicago. In 1871, the city was reduced to charred ruins in a matter of hours. The official explanation was simple enough. A barn, a lantern, a spark, a blaze that leapt across wooden buildings like wind across a dry field. By morning, 3 square miles were gone, but the aftermath was even more curious than the disaster itself. Instead of rebuilding on the same ground level, the city chose to raise entire sections of the downtown streets by several feet, some places by as much as a full story. The result was unavoidable. The original ground floors of surviving buildings ended up underground. Most histories describe this as urban improvement, a chance to modernize drainage and rebuild in a more stable way. But even with those explanations, something about the speed of reconstruction still feels uncanny. Within a few short years, a city that had been turned to ash rose again with monumental stone structures that should have taken decades to design, carve, and assemble. For believers, this was the moment the questions sharpened. Were these structures rebuilt, or were they uncovered? Chicago was not alone. 1 year later, Boston experienced a massive fire of its own. Entire blocks vanished again. A year after that, another fire struck in a different part of the city. Seattle burned in 1889 under circumstances so destructive that the entire commercial district had to be rebuilt from scratch, and San Francisco suffered repeated catastrophes culminating in the earthquake-fire combination of 1906, which destroyed much of the city and forced reconstruction on an enormous scale. A single disaster might be expected, even 2, but the 19th century saw a chain of fires sweeping through major cities as if the world were rewriting itself block by block. Believers began connecting dots. They noted that in each of these cities, the rebuilding efforts included changes to street levels. They noted that new construction often appeared suspiciously rapid. Stone facades emerged almost overnight. Streets were redesigned. Buildings that once stood proudly at ground level now opened below the sidewalk. The timeline felt too compressed for the architectural results that followed. Skeptics attribute these shifts to the demands of urban growth. Fires cleared space, cities modernized, technology advanced. But for those who study the mud flood mystery, the timing feels too convenient. If a catastrophe had buried large portions of cities, then a second catastrophe such as a fire could be a perfect cover for reconstruction. a way to disguise the work of removing debris and reformatting the street level, a way to hide what truly happened before the fire. Was this the case? Or was it simply a century in which wooden cities collided with industrial growth and poor safety standards? No document confirms anything unusual. No official record suggests a hidden agenda, but the pattern remains unsettling. Fires should be random, yet in the 19th century they seemed almost systematic, striking city after city with enough force to erase entire districts and reorder the surface of the urban world. And here is where the theory gains its momentum. When disaster forces a city to rebuild, the people living there inherit a new normal. They adapt quickly. They forget the previous levels. They walk new sidewalks and forget there were doors under their feet. History stabilizes itself. The past becomes hidden not by conspiracy, but by routine. Still, the question lingers. Did the fires simply clear the way for modernization, or did they offer a convenient cover for something far older and far stranger lying beneath the 19th century streets? Believers say the pattern is too perfect to ignore. Skeptics say it is coincidence shaped by the hazards of wooden architecture. But both sides agree on one thing. The 19th century was not as simple as school lessons make it seem. Because when so many cities burn and rise again, all within a single era, the ashes do not just hide what was lost. They also hide what was found. If you want to feel the mud flood mystery, rather than simply hear about it, there is only one thing you need to do. Go to Seattle, walk into the Pioneer Square district, buy a ticket for a tour that should not exist. Then follow the guide as they lead you down a narrow staircase tucked behind an ordinary storefront. The moment your feet touch the floor below, you realize something strange. You are no longer in a basement. You are in a street. The ceiling above you was once the sky. The dim corridors around you were once open sidewalks. Shops that now feel like tunnels once had bright windows facing the world outside. You walk past bricked-up doorways and signs advertising long-forgotten businesses. Everything down here feels misplaced, like a fossil that still remembers it was alive. This is Seattle Underground, the perfect example believers point to when they argue that entire cities have been buried before. The difference is that in this case, the history is documented. Seattle burned in 1889. The city chose to rebuild one story higher to escape flooding and improve sanitation. But the effect is the same. What had been ground level became a sealed world beneath a new one. The experience of walking through these buried streets is unsettling, even when you know the official explanation. The walls still show marks from the old street lamps. The storefronts still have recessed door frames. There are granite steps that lead to nowhere and windows that stare into silence. It feels impossible that an entire layer of a city could be forgotten for decades, yet here it is preserved by accident. If this could happen in Seattle, why not elsewhere? That question fuels much of the mud flood debate. Consider San Francisco. After the earthquake and fire of 1906, the devastation was so vast that rebuilding required mountains of debris and fill. In some areas, the new street level rose by 10 or 12 feet. Buildings that survived the disaster found their first floors buried beneath the new grade of the rebuilt districts. Many of those buried entrances still exist. You can find half-submerged facades and windows that make no sense at their current elevation. London offers another example, though its history stretches far deeper. The city has been rebuilt on top of itself so many times that entire Roman streets lie beneath modern buildings. In some excavations, archaeologists descend through medieval layers, then past Saxon remains, then down to the stonework of a city that existed 2,000 years ago. Each generation simply built on top of what came before until the buried world became the foundation for the new one. Paris reveals the same pattern through its catacombs and forgotten quarries. Streets have shifted, foundations have risen, old levels have become new basements. What was once a street can become a tunnel with only a few centuries of change. And then there is Rome, where the modern street level sits so high above the ancient one that it can feel like walking through a city floating above another world. Temples that once towered over citizens now sit sunken behind railings. Ancient floors are far below your feet, reached by staircases that descend through layers of time. None of this involved a single catastrophic event. It was slow accumulation, but the visual outcome is the same. A buried city beneath a living one. For skeptics, these cases prove that there are many natural and documented ways urban layers can stack on top of each other. Fires, earthquakes, flooding, reconstruction, sediment build-up, the shifting needs of a growing population. History offers plenty of explanations that do not require a global event. But for believers, these examples raise a different question. If cities can be buried accidentally or intentionally in well-recorded cases, then what about the ones where the record is silent? What about places where there is no clear documentation, no major fire, no catastrophic earthquake, no public project razing the streets? Why do some buildings in those cities still appear half submerged? And perhaps the most provocative question is this. If Seattle had never preserved its underground streets, if the entrances had been sealed, if the story had been forgotten, would visitors today simply assume that the buried windows and sunken doorways were meaningless architectural quirks? Would Seattle look like evidence of a mysterious event instead of a documented reconstruction? In other words, how many other cities could have stories like this that no one ever recorded or remembered? Seattle Underground is a reminder that the world can bury itself faster than most people realize. That entire levels of a city can vanish beneath the surface within a single generation. That the line between a documented historical event and an unexplained mystery is often only the thickness of a forgotten story. In the mudflood debate, this is where the tension lies. Are we looking at misunderstood evidence or at the remnants of something far stranger? As we move forward, the questions only grow sharper, because the deeper you go into this mystery, the more you begin to wonder whether buried cities are the exception or the rule. If the mudflood mystery had remained only about buried buildings, it might have faded as a curious architectural puzzle. But something else stirred the imagination of researchers online, something older and much more provocative. The discovery of a name that once covered half of Asia on historical maps. A name that should have been familiar, yet felt strangely absent from modern history books. That name was Tartaria. At first glance, the old maps look ordinary. Faded parchment, careful lines tracing mountains and rivers. But then your eyes drift to the massive northern expanse stretching from Siberia toward Mongolia and across the steppes. Printed across this territory is a single sweeping label, Great Tartary, or sometimes Grand Tartary. On other maps, it appears simply as Tartaria, a title applied to a landmass so large it rivals the size of entire empires. The sight of it raises an immediate question. If this region was once labelled as a unified civilization, why do we hear so little about it today? Why do modern maps not mention it? Why do mainstream histories treat Tartaria as if it never existed? For believers, this absence feels suspicious. They argue that an empire that spanned continents cannot simply evaporate from memory without deliberate erasure. They suggest that Tartaria was not just a geographic label, but a powerful civilization whose achievements were removed from the historical record after a cataclysmic event. In their view, the mud flood and the disappearance of Tartaria are not separate mysteries but parts of the same puzzle. To understand how this idea formed, we must first explore what those old maps actually meant. The truth is less dramatic, but no less interesting. European cartographers of the 17th and 18th centuries often used broad regional names to describe territories they did not fully understand. Tartary was one of them, a catch-all term applied to lands inhabited by various groups from the Turkic peoples to Mongol tribes to Siberian communities. It was not the name of a unified empire. It was a label for the unknown. But maps have a way of shaping imagination far beyond their original intent. When modern researchers stumbled across these ancient titles without context, the word Tartaria did not look like a placeholder. It looked like a forgotten nation erased from history, a gap waiting to be filled by speculation. As online communities grew and shared maps with each other, the theory began to crystallize. They noticed that Tartaria appeared on maps for centuries, then abruptly vanished in the 19th century. They saw this disappearance as evidence of a cover-up. A narrative emerged claiming that after a global catastrophe, possibly the mud flood, the surviving powers carved up the world, erased Tartarian history, and rebuilt society on top of its remnants. Architecture became part of the story. Believers pointed to grand stone buildings from the 19th century and argued that they were not built by the societies that claimed them, but by the Tartarian civilization. They suggested that the stylistic similarities across continents were not signs of shared European influence, but the fading echoes of a global cultural network that once unified vast territories. This theory gained momentum for one simple reason. It offered an explanation for everything: the photographs and buried windows and architectural anomalies that did not seem to fit comfortably into mainstream narratives. Where conventional history saw independent developments, believers saw fragments of a fallen world. But the rise of Tartaria as a lost civilization also stemmed from something deeper, a sense that parts of history feel incomplete, that entire chapters may be missing, that civilizations known only through faint traces might have shaped the world more profoundly than we realize. In that sense, the maps did not lie. They revealed a truth about human imagination and about our desire to fill silence with story. Yet the mystery remains. Why did the name Tartaria disappear so abruptly from atlases? Why do textbooks rarely mention it? Why does the region seem to dissolve into fragmented histories just as the modern age begins? The accepted explanations speak of expanding empires, more accurate mapping, and the transition from vague regional terms to precise political boundaries. But for many people, those answers feel too neat, too convenient for a territory once depicted on maps with such vast authority. This is where the tension lives between what history records and what people feel it should have recorded, between the known and the possible, between the maps that survived and the stories that did not. As the mud flood theory continued to evolve, Tartaria became its silent giant, a civilization reconstructed not from artifacts, but from absence, a world made visible through the outlines where knowledge fails. Whether this interpretation is true or imagined, its influence cannot be denied. For believers, Tartaria is the missing chapter that explains everything. For skeptics, it is a misunderstanding of old geography. But for anyone curious enough to follow the mystery, it serves as a reminder that history is often defined not only by what is written, but by what is forgotten. And forgotten stories have a way of returning when the world begins to ask questions. Walk through any major city built in the 19th century, and you will eventually encounter a building that makes you pause. Not because it is old, but because it feels older than it should be. A courthouse with pillars that resemble ancient temples. A train station with ceilings so high they echo like cathedrals. Stone arches carved with a precision that seems out of place for an era of horse-drawn carts and gas lamps. These structures do not look like the work of a world just discovering electricity. They look like relics from civilizations far more advanced than the societies that claim to have built them. And for many who study the mud flood mystery, this architectural puzzle is not a side note. It is the heart of the debate. The question is simple. How did cities in the late 1800s produce such monumental works of stone and masonry in such short periods of time, often with limited technology and a rapidly growing population demanding immediate infrastructure? Supporters of the mud flood theory argue that the answer is straightforward. They believe these buildings were not constructed in the 19th century at all. They were inherited, left behind by a previous civilization whose architectural knowledge far exceeded what modern historians attribute to that era. A civilization that might have been wiped out during a global event, and whose surviving structures were repurposed and claimed by the societies that emerged afterward. The argument grows stronger when you look at the speed of construction reported during that time. In many cities, massive civic buildings were completed in only a few years, not just one or two, but dozens. Entire neighborhoods filled with ornate facades and towering monuments seemed to rise almost overnight. For believers, the timeline appears impossible. How could artisans carve thousands of stones with hand tools? How could cities lacking modern machinery construct domes larger than anything their architects had built before? How could workers produce such scale, such detail, and such precision under the conditions of the 19th century? Skeptics offer explanations. They point to large labor forces, massive immigration waves, and the disciplined training of stonemasons and craftsmen. They note that architectural styles such as neoclassical and Baroque served as templates replicated across nations. But even these explanations raise more questions. Why do so many buildings share nearly identical proportions and motifs, even when located on opposite sides of the world? Why are some architectural elements so complex that modern builders struggle to recreate them even with advanced equipment? Then there is the matter of materials. Many of these grand structures were made from stone blocks so large they defy the idea of rapid construction. Some weigh several tons, yet were supposedly lifted into place with basic pulleys and wooden scaffolding. The more you study the logistics, the more the puzzle deepens. How many workers would have been required? How long would each carving take? How did they achieve such uniformity across massive facades? Buildings in Moscow, mirror buildings in New York. Structures in Melbourne echo structures in Vienna. Even smaller cities contain unexpected architectural gems that seem far beyond their economic and technological capabilities at the time they were supposedly built. Believers see these similarities not as coincidence, but as remnants of a unified architectural language, one that belonged to an earlier world. A world that might have shared advanced construction knowledge. A world that left behind monumental buildings that the 19th century inherited rather than created. One detail often discussed is the presence of enormous arched entrances that seem disproportionate to their reported purpose. Doorways far larger than any human need, windows that tower far above street level, facades that look designed for a scale slightly different from the people who inhabit them now. Believers argue that these dimensions suggest structures built for another civilization, or at least for different cultural needs than the ones we assume. There is also the curious lack of photographic evidence showing the construction of many of these buildings. While the 19th century produced countless photos of daily life, remarkably few images show the process of erecting these monumental structures. The absence of construction footage is not proof of an alternative history, but for those who already doubt the official narrative, it feels like one more missing piece. The more you compare the architecture of the 19th century with the capabilities historians ascribe to that period, the more the contrasts stand out. The era was filled with wooden shacks and muddy roads, yet somehow also produced some of the most impressive stone buildings ever created. How did these two extremes coexist so closely in time? It is this contradiction that fuels the theories. Not that the buildings exist, but that they seem too perfect, too grand, too uniform, and too numerous for the circumstances of their age. Skeptics believe there are answers grounded in history and economics. Believers see an echo of something older resonating through the stones, something almost familiar but not quite. Something that suggests the 19th century was not the beginning of modern civilization, but the recovery from a previous one. Whatever the truth, the architectural puzzle demands attention. Because even if the official explanations are correct, the scale and speed of these constructions represent one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. And if the believers are correct, then the buildings are not achievements of the 19th century at all, but the last surviving monuments of a forgotten world. Either way, the question remains, how did they build them? Or perhaps more unsettling, did they build them at all? At some point in the mudflood debate, the questions move beyond buried windows and strange foundations. People begin to notice another detail that appears across grand buildings of the 19th century. Towers, spires, domes. Metal-tipped peaks rising above courthouses, capitol buildings, opera houses, train stations, and entire city centres. And once you start noticing them, you cannot stop. They are everywhere. To most people, these architectural features are simply decorative, beautiful signatures of an era inspired by classical design. But to believers, they resemble something else entirely. Components of a system, pieces of a forgotten technology, echoes of a world that may have understood energy in a way we no longer do. The idea seems outrageous at first, but the deeper you look, the more questions emerge. The theory begins with the observation that many older buildings contain metal rods or finials at their highest points. Some are copper, some are iron. Some show signs they once carried wiring or conductive pathways. These features often sit atop domes or cupolas shaped in a way that seems to focus or capture something. Supporters argue that these structures may not have been ornamental at all, but functional. Devices meant to harvest atmospheric electricity. Their reasoning follows a simple line. If the 19th century was a time before widespread fossil fuel systems and before electrical grids, why did so many public buildings include complex metalwork at their highest points? What purpose did these shapes serve beyond decoration? Why did cultures across continents choose to replicate the same forms at the same time without any direct communication? Believers then point to Nikola Tesla, who famously experimented with atmospheric electricity in the late 19th century. Tesla believed that the Earth and the sky formed a natural electrical circuit that could power devices without wires. If Tesla was exploring this idea openly, they argue, who is to say an older civilization had not already mastered it centuries before? The domes become resonators in this interpretation. The spires become antennas. The ornate metalwork becomes a lattice designed to draw power from the air. The entire building becomes a machine disguised as architecture. Skeptics counter these claims with practical explanations. The metal rods were lightning protection systems. The domes provided ventilation. The towers were stylistic choices influenced by European traditions. They point out that there is no surviving documentation describing these buildings as power stations. No blueprints showing energy distribution systems. No machinery hidden within the walls. But believers respond with another question. If an advanced civilization had been wiped out by a global event, would documentation have survived? Would blueprints remain? Would people rebuilding the world have understood what they had inherited? Or would they have simply reused the surviving structures, ignoring the deeper purpose of their design? This tension between symbolic architecture and functional architecture lies at the core of the theory. Many buildings from the 19th century possess a level of geometric precision that seems unnecessary for their public roles. Their proportions follow harmonic ratios. Their domes align with acoustic and electromagnetic principles. Their layouts resemble patterns found in older sacred sites from ancient civilizations. To believers, these similarities are not coincidence. They are clues, pieces of a forgotten science that blended art and engineering in ways the modern world does not fully explore. Then there is the matter of orphan machines, devices found in attics and basements of old buildings whose original purpose is unclear. Heating systems that do not align with known technologies. Ventilation shafts that seem too complex for simple airflow. Channels and voids within walls that resemble conduits rather than structural supports. No single feature proves anything. but together they create a landscape of unanswered questions. The idea that buildings once generated or distributed free energy is not mainstream. It sits at the border between speculation and myth, but it persists because it offers an explanation for the ambition and scale of 19th century architecture. Why invest so much effort into designs that appear overbuilt for their purposes? Why include details that modern builders rarely replicate? Why create towers that serve no obvious function beyond aesthetic beauty? Believers argue that the beauty is the function, that these buildings were not only civic monuments, but engines of the city itself. Engines that harmonized with the natural world and produced energy without fuel. If such knowledge existed, it would explain why these structures appear almost sacred. Why their design seems rooted in principles older than the societies that claimed them. Whether this theory is true or not is not the point. What matters is that the questions it raises cannot be dismissed easily. Architecture speaks. Shapes carry meaning. And the buildings of the 19th century speak a language that feels both familiar and mysterious, as if they belong to our world but remember another. Perhaps the towers were only decorations, perhaps the domes only symbols, or perhaps they were something more, something that once hummed with power now lost to silence. The truth remains uncertain, but the theory endures because it invites us to imagine a past where energy was not scarce and technology was not bound by wires. A past where the world itself might have been the power source, and if that were ever true, then the buildings standing in our cities today are not simply monuments of stone and brick. They are the fossils of a forgotten science waiting for someone to listen. If there is any chapter of 19th century history that makes believers pause in disbelief, it is the story of the world fairs. On paper, these events were celebrations of human progress, vast exhibitions where nations displayed their latest inventions and architectural triumphs. But when you examine the scale of what was built, the timelines involved, and the fate of these structures after the fairs ended, the story begins to feel less like history and more like a riddle. Start with the Chicago World Fair of 1893. Known as the White City, it covered hundreds of acres and featured grand boulevards, shimmering waterways, and monumental buildings with domes and colonnades that rivaled ancient Rome. The fairgrounds looked like a utopian city risen from nowhere. They appeared to be constructed from stone carved with exquisite detail. They looked permanent, timeless, almost sacred. Yet according to official accounts, they were built in under 2 years, mostly from temporary materials coated to resemble stone. And after the fair ended, nearly all of them were destroyed. To many, this explanation seems improbable. How could workers using 19th century tools create an entire city of monumental architecture in such a short time? What level of craftsmanship and coordination would be required? How could structures that looked like cathedrals and palaces rise so quickly only to be torn down immediately afterward? Why would a society invest so much effort into buildings intended to last mere months? These questions become sharper when you examine other fairs of the era. The St. Louis Fair of 1904, the Paris Exposition of 1889, the Buffalo Pan American Exposition, the San Francisco Panama Pacific Exhibition. Each featured buildings so grand they appeared to surpass the architectural limits of their time. Towers stretched into the sky. Domes rivaled the scale of ancient monuments. Facades displayed carvings and symmetry that would challenge modern builders. And yet, despite this magnificence, the official narrative insists that most of these structures were temporary facades made of plaster or staff, a mixture of plaster and fibres moulded over wooden frames. If this is true, it raises its own questions. Why construct buildings of such overwhelming beauty only to discard them? Why not preserve even a few as national treasures? Why did so many fairs follow the same pattern, build the impossible, then destroy it? Believers propose an alternative explanation. They suggest that some of the fair buildings were not constructed for the fairs at all, but were remnants of an older civilization, discovered, repaired, and rebranded as part of the exhibitions. In this view, the fairs were not celebrations of new progress, but reveals of old structures. A final public display before these buildings were dismantled or buried to rewrite the narrative of history. This interpretation gains strength from photographs of the fairs that show immense stone-like buildings with a level of detail difficult to achieve with temporary materials. Some images reveal cracks and aging inconsistent with freshly built plaster. Others show workers performing what appears to be restoration rather than construction. Believers argue that the fairs served as a transitional moment, a way to introduce the architecture of a lost civilization under the guise of modern achievement. Skeptics counter that these structures were indeed temporary and that their scale was possible due to large budgets and an enormous labour force. They emphasise that the plaster and staff materials allowed for rapid creation of ornate designs. They point out that detailed models and drawings were preserved, which proved the buildings were designed for short-term use. But even these explanations do not fully satisfy the question of motive. If the structures were temporary, why design them with such extraordinary complexity? Why build cathedrals that would last only months? Why carve ornaments that would soon crumble under rain and wind? Why not construct simpler halls that served the same purpose? The mystery deepens when you notice the recurring aesthetic across fairs worldwide. The same domes, the same columns, the same towers and arches. A uniform style that reappears across continents as if echoing a common blueprint. To believers, this consistency suggests a shared origin not among modern architects, but among the remnants of a forgotten world. Some even speculate that the fairs served as a controlled demolition, a way to remove the last standing structures of Tartaria while disguising their destruction as the dismantling of temporary exhibits. In this narrative, the world fairs become a symbolic transition from the old world to the new, from inherited architecture to industrial modernity. Whether this is true or not, the mystery remains. The world fairs of the 19th century were unlike anything before or since. Their scale, their beauty, their sudden appearance, their rapid disappearance. These events feel like anomalies in the historical record. As if for a brief moment the world displayed a glimpse of something extraordinary, then quietly erased it. The question is not only how these buildings were made, but why they were made at all, and why their story is so strangely short. Grand cities born in months and gone in months. Architecture that seems ancient, yet belongs to a modern era. Beauty that was never meant to last, at least according to the official accounts. But if beauty was not the point, then what was? This is the question that lingers as we move deeper into the mud flood mystery. Because if the fairs were not simply exhibitions, then they might have been something else entirely. A stage, a cover, or a farewell to a civilization whose traces were already fading beneath the rising layers of the 19th century world. As compelling as the mud flood mystery is, there is another side to this story. A quieter one. A story told not by theories or speculation, but by the planet itself. Because long before anyone spoke of buried doors or sunken windows, the Earth had already proven that it could swallow whole cities with startling ease. Travel to Italy and stand in the ruins of Pompeii. The stillness is haunting, streets perfectly preserved, homes frozen in time, life captured in the moment it was extinguished. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, the city was buried in a matter of hours under ash hot enough to fuse stone and silence. Entire buildings vanished beneath a sudden tide of volcanic debris. Doors, windows, staircases, whole rooms sealed in layers of earth for nearly 2,000 years. Not by conspiracy, not by forgotten civilizations, but by nature. Move to Herculaneum, just a short distance away, and the story becomes even more dramatic. There the pyroclastic surge buried the city under depths of material so dense that excavators today dig through multiple stories of compacted volcanic rock to reach the ancient streets. Entire buildings sit intact beneath layers far thicker than what the mud flood theory proposes. If nature can do this in a single day, what might it do over centuries? Consider the phenomenon of soil accumulation. Cities create their own sediment as they grow. Dust from unpaved roads, ash from chimneys, debris from construction, organic matter accumulating around foundations. Over decades, these layers rise slowly, often unnoticed, until they reach a new equilibrium above the original street level. Archaeologists have a term for this process: stratification. Over centuries, it can lift the ground by several feet, in some ancient sites by several meters. Modern observers might see buried windows and assume catastrophe. To a geologist or urban historian, the same site may be interpreted as the natural consequence of human activity layered over time. Then there is liquefaction. In an earthquake, the ground can momentarily behave like a liquid, especially in areas with loose sand or saturated soil. Entire structures can sink, foundations can tilt, streets can warp. Buildings that once stood proudly above ground may find themselves lowered relative to a changed surface. The event is swift enough to feel catastrophic, yet subtle enough to leave no dramatic ruins behind. Examples of this phenomenon appear in records from the Pacific Northwest, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Asia. Though less visually dramatic than volcanic burial, liquefaction has quietly reshaped ground levels in countless regions throughout history. Flooding also plays its part. Rivers deposit sediment. Storm surges sweep debris inland. In low-lying areas, it is not unusual for the land to elevate slightly after each major flood as layers accumulate. Over time, the original ground level disappears beneath the new one. Houses that once sat comfortably at street level may find their lower floors beneath earth, deposited by natural forces rather than human construction. Even human intervention can mimic natural burial. When cities rebuild after disasters, they often raise entire districts to prevent future flooding. They bring in soil, they level terrain, they create new streets above the old ones. Seattle, as we explored earlier, did this explicitly. San Francisco did it after earthquakes. Many European cities did it after fires. Each time, the original architecture became a buried layer beneath the new urban surface. This is why archaeologists working in Rome can descend through centuries of construction to reach the ancient ground. Why explorers in London have found Roman roads beneath medieval foundations. Why Paris has hidden levels below busy boulevards. The world buries itself not always in an instant, but often slowly, persistently, and without intention. None of these explanations disprove the mud flood theory, but they do show that the planet does not need mysterious forces to create buried architecture. It has been doing so naturally for millennia. For some, the scientific explanations feel more satisfying than the speculative ones. They offer clarity and a framework grounded in physical processes. But for others, they raise a different question. If nature and human development can bury cities this easily, then how many buried layers might exist that we have not yet discovered? How many forgotten streets lie beneath modern ones? How many windows hidden by soil tell stories we have not reconstructed? And most importantly, if natural forces can bury a city in a day or a century, then perhaps the line between natural and mysterious might be thinner than we imagine. Because whether through ash or sediment or rising ground levels, the Earth can bury a world so completely that future generations may never realize it existed. Nature does not need a mud flood to erase a civilization. It needs only time. This realization creates an unexpected bridge between science and speculation. Both agree on one truth. What lies beneath our feet is far older and far more complex than most of us have ever been taught. Long before maps hinted at lost civilizations, and long before photographs revealed buildings buried beneath rising soil, humanity carried another kind of evidence: stories. Myths passed down from ancestors who claimed they had witnessed the end of a world and the beginning of another. Tales of a great flood appear in so many cultures across the planet that it becomes impossible to dismiss them as coincidence. They are echoes of something powerful, something unforgettable, something that stamped itself into the human mind. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes a flood sent by the gods to wipe clean the earth. The hero Utnapishtim survives by building a vessel and preserving life. This story predates the book of Genesis, yet mirrors it with striking accuracy. A warning, a deluge, a lone survivor, a world reshaped. In ancient Hebrew tradition, the story of Noah repeats the same pattern: a catastrophic flood, whole cities swept away, civilization reduced to a remnant. When the waters recede, a new chapter begins. A new world rises from the mud left behind. Travel to Greece and the pattern appears again. The myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha describes a flood that destroys humanity, sparing only a virtuous couple. They repopulate the earth by casting stones behind them, stones that become new people. The landscape is washed clean and reborn. Across the world in India, ancient Vedic texts tell the story of Manu, who is warned by a divine being that a flood is coming. He builds a boat and ties it to a great fish that guides him to safety. When the flood ends, a new humanity emerges from the survivors. Chinese legends speak of a deluge so massive it reshaped mountains and rivers. Emperor Yu is said to have tamed the waters through engineering and discipline, bringing order back to a drowned world. The story is not simply symbolic. Archaeological evidence suggests real ancient flooding in the Yellow River Basin. In the Pacific Islands, oral traditions recall waves that rose without warning, swallowing villages whole. In Australia, Aboriginal stories describe a time when the sea consumed ancient coastlines. Many of these tales date back thousands of years, possibly reflecting rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. Even in the far north, Inuit and First Nations communities preserve stories of waters rising so fast that entire bands fled to higher ground. In Central and South America, the Maya and Aztec recount earlier worlds destroyed by floods. In North America, tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Plains share legends of deluges that reshaped their ancestral lands. These myths come from cultures that never met. Societies separated by oceans, languages, and entire continents, yet they describe the same event: a world covered in water, a catastrophe that swept away cities and people, a moment after which nothing was the same. To anthropologists, these similarities suggest a shared memory of real geological events. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise by hundreds of feet. Entire coastlines vanished. Low-lying lands flooded. Regions like Doggerland, which once connected Britain to Europe, disappeared beneath the sea. The trauma of these changes could have etched itself into the collective memory of humanity. Believers in the mud flood theory see these myths as possible evidence of a much more recent catastrophe, one that occurred closer to the 18th or 19th century. They argue that if ancient cultures retain memories of devastation for thousands of years, then modern societies could have forgotten a lesser event within just a few generations, especially if that event disrupted record-keeping or destroyed infrastructure. Skeptics counter that myths evolve over time, often blending metaphor and history. They caution against treating legends as literal accounts, yet even they acknowledge that such widespread consistency across global flood stories is remarkable. Something happened, something memorable enough for humanity to preserve through spoken word song carving and scripture. The deeper question is what these myths reveal about us. Why were flood stories chosen to explain the origins of new civilizations? Why did cultures imagine worlds washed clean and reborn? Why did so many believe that history is divided into ages separated by catastrophe? Perhaps it is because humanity has always sensed that the world can change suddenly and without warning, that disasters do not ask permission, that civilizations, no matter how strong, can be erased by forces older and greater than themselves. Maybe these myths endure because they prepare us for the truth that history is not a straight line, but a series of worlds rising and falling. In the context of the mud flood mystery, these ancient stories serve as a reminder. Whether real floods or symbolic ones, the idea of a world ending in mud and water is not new. It is one of the oldest stories we tell, a story that might reflect memories of events we barely understand, memories that linger in stone in myth and perhaps even in the buried architecture beneath our cities. The question is not only whether these myths describe literal floods, it is whether they hint at a deeper pattern, one that humanity has lived through before and may live through again. A cycle of rising and falling, buried worlds and reborn worlds, forgotten ages that leave only fragments behind. And if such cycles exist, then the 19th century might not be as isolated from this ancient rhythm as we think. Which leads us closer to another mystery, a different kind of loss, not of stories, but of knowledge. For many people, the mud flood theory works as a doorway into a broader question, one that stretches far beyond the 19th century. How much knowledge have we actually lost? How many discoveries have vanished not because of conspiracy, but because time itself is a relentless eraser? When you look closely at the archaeological record, you find signs of brilliance that should not exist, brilliance that seems out of place for the age in which it appeared. Take the Antikythera mechanism discovered in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece. At first it looked like a corroded lump of bronze. Only after careful study did researchers realize it was a complex geared device capable of tracking the movements of the sun, the moon, and possibly the planets. It used precision engineering, approaching the sophistication of clockwork that would not reappear in Europe for more than 1,000 years. Its existence suggests that ancient Greek technology reached heights far beyond what history books commonly imply. Then there is Damascus steel, a legendary metal used in the Middle East for blades that were said to cut through armor and stay sharp through battle. For centuries, blacksmiths attempted to replicate the technique but failed. Only in recent decades did scientists uncover the secret. The steel contained carbon nanotubes, microscopic structures that require temperatures and conditions extremely difficult to control. How did medieval craftsmen accomplish what modern laboratories struggle to reproduce? Roman concrete offers another puzzle. Structures built by the Roman Empire have survived 2,000 years later, far more durable than many modern equivalents. When scientists analyzed the material, they found that volcanic ash within the concrete helped it grow stronger over time as seawater penetrated the mixture. The Romans had mastered a formula that later civilizations forgot. It was not rediscovered until the 21st century. Examples like these challenge the assumption that knowledge always progresses. They reveal long periods when advanced techniques emerged, flourished, and then vanished for reasons we still do not understand. Sometimes a technological lineage ends because of war. Sometimes disaster. Sometimes cultural collapse. Sometimes simple neglect. When a society falls, the most fragile thing it carries is not its monuments, but the knowledge that built them. This truth makes it easier to imagine how a civilization could leave behind monumental architecture without leaving behind the manuals or training needed to recreate it. It explains how doorways, towers, and stonework might survive while the science and mathematics behind them disappear. It also explains why later societies might rediscover such buildings and admire them without fully understanding the systems that once powered or supported them. Believers in the mud flood theory argue that if ancient cultures could produce devices like the Antikythera mechanism or metals like Damascus steel, then it is not unreasonable to imagine that another advanced society may have existed more recently. A society whose knowledge did not survive a catastrophic event. A society whose buildings might still stand even if their purpose was forgotten. Skeptics respond that these examples only show scattered brilliance, not evidence of global civilizations. But even they acknowledge that history has gaps and that knowledge can disappear quickly and without warning. They point to the burning of the Library of Alexandria, which erased countless works of science, mathematics, and philosophy. They point to the collapse of the Bronze Age, during which entire writing systems vanished. They point to the fall of the Maya, where cities remained, but much of the intellectual tradition was lost. When you examine the rise and fall of civilizations through this lens, the question becomes less about whether a society could lose knowledge, and more about how often it happens. The archaeological record shows cycles of innovation and disappearance. Times when technology advances quickly, then seems to retreat. Times when cultures build with methods we cannot replicate today. Times when the past looks far more complex than the stories we tell. Lost knowledge does not prove the mud flood theory, but it challenges the idea that the 19th century world must have possessed all the skills it claimed. It opens the possibility that some techniques could have been inherited without being understood. It suggests that buildings might preserve truths that written records do not. Most importantly, it expands the conversation beyond buried windows and architectural anomalies. It reminds us that human history is not a steady ascent, but a jagged line filled with rises and collapses. A pattern of forgetting as much as remembering. If civilizations can lose technologies like Damascus steel or astronomical computers like the Antikythera mechanism, then the idea of a forgotten architectural tradition does not seem impossible. It seems almost inevitable. And this brings us to a final question. If knowledge can vanish so easily, what else might we have lost without realizing it? What stories? What histories? What entire ages? To answer that, we must turn back to the 19th century, one last time, and examine the question that ties all of this together. Not what was lost, but what may have happened that caused the loss. We have seen the buried windows and the cities rebuilt a story higher. We have walked through underground streets and studied maps that erased entire regions. We have questioned architecture that rose too quickly and designs that felt too deliberate to be decorative. We have examined the world fairs that created impossible cities only to erase them again. We have traced ancient flood stories and uncovered examples of knowledge that should never have been lost. All of these pieces lead us to one unavoidable question. What actually happened in the 1800s? The 19th century is often taught as a time of invention and expansion. Steam engines, railroads, telegraph lines, immigration, industrial growth. But when you examine it closely, it also appears as a century shaped by silence. Records lost, fires destroying archives, wars rewriting borders, entire neighborhoods erased and rebuilt, technologies emerging from nowhere, and cities whose foundations do not match their timelines. Two interpretations stand before us. The first is the traditional one. Nature buried cities, fires reset urban centers, floods and earthquakes reshaped landscapes. Architects borrowed from European styles. Builders created monumental structures because labor was cheap and ambition was high. The rapid changes of the industrial age created an illusion of impossibility, but nothing extraordinary occurred. It was simply a moment in history where innovation and expansion collided at a rapid pace. The second interpretation is the one whispered by the mud flood theory, that something happened on a scale we have not fully understood, something that forced societies to rebuild quickly, something that altered ground levels, something that erased a chapter of civilization, leaving behind architecture that did not match the era that claimed it. In this version, the 19th century was not the birthplace of modern civilization, but the recovery from a previous one. Which interpretation is correct? The truth may not sit entirely with one or the other. History is rarely either or. Often it is both. Natural processes can bury cities. Documented disasters can reshape nations. And yet there can still be gaps, missing stories, lost technologies, forgotten layers of the world that textbooks never mention. We know that civilizations rise and fall. We know that knowledge can vanish. We know that myths can preserve memories longer than archives. What makes the 19th century compelling is not proof of a secret cataclysm. It is the weight of the questions that linger. Why do entire districts look older than their documented age? Why do buildings seem inherited rather than constructed? Why do so many cities share the same architectural anomalies? Why were monumental structures built and then destroyed almost immediately? Why do flood myths appear globally? Why do some technologies seem to appear fully formed as if rediscovered, not invented? These questions do not accuse, they invite. They ask us to reconsider the certainty with which we view the past. They remind us that history is not a straight road but a landscape full of hidden layers, some visible, some silent, some waiting to be unearthed. The idea of a lost civilization buried beneath the 19th century may never move beyond speculation, but the curiosity it inspires reveals something important. People sense when a story feels incomplete. They recognize patterns even when explanations fall short. They feel the weight of unanswered questions even when the official narrative is tidy and complete. If the 19th century did undergo a reset, whether natural or forgotten or simply misunderstood, then its traces live all around us. In the windows beneath our feet, in the doorways sunk below the street, in the massive stone facades whose builders left few records, in the strange beauty of structures that look like they remember a world older than the one we see. Perhaps nothing extraordinary happened. Perhaps everything did. The only certainty is that the past is not as simple as it appears, and this is the real heart of the mudflood mystery, not the buried buildings, or the vanished maps, or the theories themselves, but the realization that history still holds secrets, that the world we walk through may be layered with stories missing from our textbooks, that beneath every city there may be another city, and beneath every explanation another question. The 19th century may never reveal all of its truths, but the mystery it leaves behind achieves something valuable. It teaches us to look closer, to question what we think we know, and to remember that even in the modern world, the past is not finished with us. If you enjoyed exploring this mystery with us, feel free to like, share, or subscribe so you can join us the next time we step into the strange corners of forgotten history. Your presence here means more than you know.